Welcome to Politics and Tactics. We got a great show for you tonight. Unfortunately, my co-host PJ Norwood is unable to be with us, but we have a great guest, somebody that's held in very high esteem in the fire service. He has a reputation that precedes him, Kenneth Willette. He's the Executive Director of the North American Fire Training Directors. Now, a lot of you may not even have ever heard of this group, except if you're a training officer. So tonight we got two purposes. We're going to break down his organization, what he's been doing, but we're going to also talk about this new proposed OSHA standard where comments close at midnight tonight. Ken Willette spent 35 years in the fire service and is still working in the fire service to make us all safe. He rose to the rank of fire chief in 2 Massachusetts towns, and he spent 8 years leading teams that supported first responder standards development and fire service solutions at NFPA. And this OSHA standard defers to a lot of NFPA standards, so I think we got the perfect guy who can break this down and explain how this whole process works. He's also the former president of the Fire Chiefs Association in Massachusetts, and he's a graduate of the National Fire Academy Executive Officers Program, and he has a BS in fire protection. So tonight we're going to cut through the BS, and Ken's going to break down what this all means. Ken, welcome to Politics and Tactics. We appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate it. Thank you for the kind words in the introduction. I guess if you hang around long enough in the fire service, they begin to call you esteemed. I don't know if that's a polite way of saying you're old, but I do appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. No, in all honesty, you have a great reputation in the fire service, and we really appreciate you coming on. You got some big shoes to fill. Our last guest was RFK Jr., so this show gets the best. So we appreciate you coming on, another Massachusetts guy. So can you explain what the mission of your organization is? Because, you know, I was a training officer, so I was familiar with the great work of the organization. But I think that if you walked into the firehouses across America, a lot of firefighters and even ranked firefighters aren't even aware of your organization, but yet you play such an important role in the fire service.
Sure. So North American Fire Training Directors, or NAFTY, as we abbreviate it, has been around since the early 1980s. We are one of the 7 sisters, and the 7 sisters were the original national level organizations that signed on to the first, the America's Burning Act back in the 70s or 80s when it was, and led to the formation of the U.S. Fire Administration. Were referenced in the AFG statutory language as being one of the agencies that will be at the table and looking at the criteria for AFG grants. In fact, we were just at the National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg 2 weeks ago and participated in the criteria development project program. And we are a membership organization. So our members are the state and provincial level directors of fire service training. So we are global in the sense that we are not only the United States, but we are Canada. Currently, out of 50 U.S. states, we have 48 enrolled as members. And in Canada, we have 4 Canadian provinces plus the Canadian National Defence, which is the firefighting school for the Canadian military, enrolled as members. When we tell a lot of people how many members we have, they say, you know, what are you talking? 52, 53? It's not a lot of members. Well, while we're small in numbers, what we deliver in our ability to influence the direction of the fire service is huge. When we did our last survey in 2021, we estimated annually we were training close to 1 million firefighters collectively through all of our systems. And you say, well, how the heck can that be? How can you have 53 members training close to 1 million? Well, some of our members are very large organizations like TEACS at Texas A&M, IFSI, Illinois Fire Service Institute at the University of Illinois, the Florida Fire College. In Louisiana, we have a large operation. MIFRI, Maryland Fire Rescue Institute. These organizations are training in the tens of thousands, if not more, per year. So they have a very large reach. They have multiple campuses. They have hundreds of staff, and they teach a wide variety of courses. And then we have some middle-sized organizations, like here in Massachusetts, where I live. The Massachusetts Fire Academy has 4 campuses and is training in the tens of thousands annually, but maybe a little bit on the lower edge. And then we have smaller organizations in some small states where you have an office of 1 or 2 people who are overseeing the delivery of training through other mechanisms, kind of like a franchise model. But nonetheless, they're still training in the thousands. So as I said, collectively, we're training close to 1 million firefighters annually. What sets our members apart from, Frank, like you said, you were a training officer. So what sets us apart from training officers? Department and regional level training. Well, our members typically have executive branch designation. In other words, the governor of the state or an executive branch office, such as the Department of the Fire Marshal in some states or the Public Safety Academy Department in other states, have given our members the authority to be the sole training person for the geopolitical environs of that state, to establish curriculum, to establish academies and training. So that kind of sets us apart because we have high-level statutory authority, if you will, to conduct our training and deliver our training. The second thing that sets us apart, almost all of our members are delivering training that has been accredited so that when students complete their training, they can sit for an exam, a written and a performance skills exam. And if they pass it successfully, they can then be considered as certified to a particular NFPA standard. So when you hear about a certified firefighter or an NFPA 1001 firefighter, meaning they're certified, that's typically through one of our organizations. And it is the Pro Board or IFSAC are the 2 global fire service accrediting bodies that come out and look at our curriculum. They look at our delivery methods, they look at our policies and procedures, and they decide if we will be accredited. So it's kind of like an audit of our processes and our alignment with the job performance requirements of the NFPA standards. So that's very much sets us apart from a lot of the other training mechanisms. The other thing we got is we got campuses. We got real estate in every state and province. We have physical training. We are heavily invested in virtual training. We are heavily invested in live fire training, and many of our academies have NFPA 1403 live fire training facilities. They have car fire props. They have aircraft rescue firefighting props. They have technical rescue props. We invest heavily in hands-on training. So that's pretty much a nutshell. We're proud of where we are in the fire service today. We're proud of the legacy we honor by having been around for as long as we have and carrying on the tradition of quality training to produce competent firefighters, to make them safe, but also to serve the needs of the communities that they protect. That's us in a nutshell, Frank.
And that's a lot, but that's so critical to the fire service's mission. And another thing that you do that you didn't speak to today is that your organization put out a letter, a comment for the new OSHA proposed emergency response standards. So as part of your organization, you weigh in on regulations and standards at NFPA as well. Is that correct? Fair to say?
That's correct. We do have some members who sit on NFPA technical committees and provide the viewpoint. We're also very connected with the International Fire Service Training Association and their curriculum development. Several of our members sit on their test bank validation committees. We are part of the Jones and Bartlett Learning Public Safety Group Fire Service Advisory Committee. We participate in the U.S. Fire Administrators work groups and have attended the summit. We are part of the National Advisory Council, which is affiliated with the Congressional Fire Services Institute. We do a lot of work with CFSI. So yes, to your point, Frank, we don't just deliver training, we utilize what we've learned and what we hear from our stakeholders, and we contribute in other ways by serving on these boards and other activities, including NFPA.
Well, when I read your organization statement today, I was really pleased because sometimes organizations kind of put blinders on what the actual mission is, and they don't consider any outside factors. So when we look at this emergency response standard, it covers medical evaluations, increased certification and training, and proper equipment that I think the fire service all agrees on. We need to keep pushing. We need to keep moving in that direction. But your agency took a responsible approach and said there are some concerns with this standard. But before we get into concerns, because of your background with NFPA, can you explain a little bit of what went into this proposed standard and how long that they've been working on this? Because one thing that I was a little concerned with is this is a behemoth. This thing is huge, this new standard. And in the past, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the past, I remember like 2 in and 2 out standard came up to revise that for RIT, which I thought was a very important standard. In fact, I believe I filed the first OSHA complaint successfully in the state of Connecticut on the 2 in and 2 out standard that helped better the department that I worked for. But that was a manageable regulation that was put forth. Everybody still had their issues, but the fire service as a whole worked through those issues, and it made the fire service bigger. Where this seems to not follow that kind of format, it seems to be all encompassing. To me, it's a gold standard without any gold. So if we could kind of talk about how this came about, because I know you have some specific background in that.
Sure. And just by way of background, when I entered the fire service back in 1974, there were no NFPA standards for protective clothing, for apparatus, for training, for safety. None of that existed. NFPA was just beginning to stand up its work in the fire service space.
Now, Ken, back then in 1974, before that, nobody was ever rescued and no fires were put out, right?
That's right. Never happened. So this is all, that was prehistoric history. Now we're in modern history. We have standards. But when I retired from my career with my health at a good age, I, in a big portion, credit the evolving standards in those organizations that pushed to have those standards integrated into the firefighting workplace. Because at that point, no standards. I can remember bargaining with my municipal employer to have NFPA standards included in the collective bargaining agreement. Because at the time, municipal purchasing was low bid. Small department, and I'm not saying ill of anybody, but low bid sometimes meant who was your friend, who gave you the best price. It really didn't speak to the needs of the fire service. So NFPA standards in time have addressed the needs of the fire service. And as I said, I feel contributed to my being able to retire with my health at a good age.
Now, there's one thing that you said that I want to break out there, because I too have pushed for advances through fire department policy and also in the collective bargaining agreement. But when you do that, you're working with the administration, management, and labor, and they have to balance the interests of the community. And I'm a firm believer in merit and standards. And just to give our listeners, an example, the city of New Haven, when they used to teach NFPA 1001, because, and this was based off a faulty premise, they thought they were helping minorities out. And they lowered the standards, and they essentially said you could pass the fire academy without getting the certification. And we were all like, that's not the answer. Everybody can succeed. We can all help each other regardless of race. And what we found is not only were they penalizing individuals by kind of setting the standard low, but then when they would graduate from the fire academy without the certification, they were boxed out of taking higher level classes at the Connecticut Fire Academy because they didn't have the prerequisites. And because that first step, that training is so immense and takes so long, where a weekend class to better yourself or a couple weekend classes is more accessible, we were finding individuals who didn't get the certification, their career level was like this. And we're like, no, if we if we work with everybody and we make sure that we're doing quality training and we're assisting everybody, we can bring up the certification level forever. And then once the union finally got management to agree and got that put in place, when I entered New Haven Fire Department, I think there was only 6, maybe 5 firefighters and officers that were Fire Officer 1. Now the department's doing Fire Officer 1 classes every other year. And, there's probably over 100 Fire Officer 1s. And so I think certification is very, very important. So anything I say tonight, I don't want individuals thinking, oh, well, he's against certification, because that's not the case at all.
Yeah. And to your point, Frank, certification validates somebody outside has looked at the skills and the knowledge and said it aligns with the NFPA job performance requirements. And again, what we have here in the United States that is so different than the rest of the world is the fire service has voluntarily adopted the NFPA professional qualification standards as the best practices and the determinants of adequate performance. You go around the globe and they have a more centrally top-down driven fire service where it's a federal authority or it's a regional authority and they decide what your professional qualifications are. Fire service doesn't really have a vote in it. It's more from the top down. So what we have here in the States through that process is remarkable, and it's made a huge impact. And through my work at NFPA, I was fortunate back in 2008 to be invited to serve on the National Advisory Commission to OSHA, the NACOSH they called it. And that's where the discussion on this proposed regulation we now see open for public comment started. And we met for, I think it was 18 months. And there was probably somewhere between 20 and 35 of us at the table for any meeting, representing all the key fire service organizations, the IAFF, the IAFC, the NVFC, the fire investigators, the fire instructors, NFPA, and others. And we even had folks who were concerned that this was exceeding the feasibility for the fire service to accept. Back in 2008, people were raising that flag. And we looked at where the current OSHA standard was, and it was focused mainly on fire brigades working in an industrial setting in a very different environment. And there was the 2 in, 2 out. There was the HAZWOPER standard. OSHA had some standards that were beginning to apply to the fire service, but you certainly wouldn't say it was a comprehensive standard. OSHA looked at the data that came out of NIOSH on the firefighter line of duty death report, the U.S. Fire Administration reports, and the National Fire Protection Association reports, and they saw the number of firefighter deaths. They saw the number of firefighter injuries and the contributing factor. They brought to the NACOSH, what can we do to impact the fire service in a positive manner through regulatory oversight to help drive those numbers down? So we started our conversation. And I want to share with those who are on the call one of the most challenging discussions we had. And Frank, it aligns with what you just shared happened in New Haven. How do you balance the need for qualified firefighters and competent training against the ability of the individual or the agency to support it, to fund it, to dedicate the time? Back in 2008, we knew that this was going to create some responsibilities for those whose firefighting service is not a career, for the volunteers. And it was going to, training is the answer to so many challenges the fire service faces. Good training yields good results, yields safer firefighters. But how do we balance that? And you use the word correctly, Frank, it's a balance. How do you balance the needs of the entire fire service community as you're looking at something? And we acknowledge somebody who's doing it as a career, they may have a better support system in place for the time commitment and getting the training resources. But we knew some volunteer organizations could easily meet what was being said here, but we knew there were some. And to this day, it remains, there are still some volunteer organizations holding pancake breakfasts to put gas in the apparatus because they are truly a volunteer organization, minimal municipal or public support. perhaps assistance in buying apparatus or building a building. But when it comes to keeping the lights on, funding the training, and the replacement of the turnout gear, a lot of these departments are doing it through fundraisers. So we understood that. And we know training costs. And we know losing a life costs. And we couldn't put a cost or a value on somebody of a volunteer versus a career. How could we set two standards for the training to keep people safe if we agree that firefighting takes place in an immediately dangerous to life and health environment, that whether you're in the backwater community in Nebraska or metropolitan New Haven, Connecticut, when you get inside that fire and you start attacking the fire, you're exposed to the same risk, the same threats. How do you manage that? So our approach was, we're not going to put a cost on it. We're not going to say one area deserves more training than the other. We just put it out there for public comment. So we finished our work back in 2009 or 10. OSHA took it under advisement, and they held it until just this year to put it out for public comment, because they had been working on it. They did make some updates, but this year they went out with it. And they're asking the public to comment. And I can let folks know that there has been a lot of comments on just that balance between folks who are not doing this for a career and folks who are doing it for a career, their ability to meet those expectations. So that's kind of the framework for how I view we got to this point, Frank.
Okay, one other thing that policymakers and elected officials often don't understand, which could also take them in the wrong direction, is NFPA bills itself as a minimum consensus standard. And when in reality, it's really not. It's an aspirational document of where we need to go. Because here's the example, and I've had these policy debates at work, is that in the state of Connecticut, I can say with the utmost confidence, there is not one department, career, volunteer, or combination, that meets all the NFPA standards. I think now every department in the state meets 1001. We're training our initial firefighters. We have gotten better. It's not 1974 anymore. We get better every single year through policy, collective bargaining, volunteer training, great organizations like yours, the Connecticut Fire Academy. But when NFPA puts out that it's a minimum consensus standard, if you're a policymaker or an elected official and you're not from the fire service, you think everybody's meeting this minimum standard across the board, and that's not the case. I took a look at this proposal. It's 83 pages around, and when you take all of the other NFPA standards and add it in, it comes up to about 2,552 pages. So it's all encompassing. I want to just take out one point. So I called the assistant chief of Greenwich, and I know that they're above where most fire departments in Connecticut are. They're doing the physicals the right way. So I'm like, what's the cost? What's the data on your physicals? And for NFPA physicals, they're paying $1,500, over $1,500 per firefighter. And I said, well, what's the breakdown? And they're the gold standard of what NFPA and OSHA would like to see. The physical itself is $750. Then it's another $300 for cancer screening and another $500 for mental health. So if you take a small volunteer department of under 50 people, just the medical evaluation, you're talking about $75,000 a year or every other year, depending on where they fall in that standard. If you took New Haven's got 367 firefighters. You're over 550,000. And for a normal large city, we're in New England, it's all small cities, but you take a Boston or a New York or any other state out there, they're larger cities. You're talking about $1 million expenditure just on the physicals. Now, here's the thing. I'm all for physicals. It's something that our physical in New Haven has gotten better and better. but it's still not to that level. Initial employment, a lot of departments will do that initial really good physical. And then it seems that the legislators and now the policymakers, chiefs, labor, were pushing to get those better physicals. But one of the things that I had to balance as a union president when this came up in New Haven to do the thing is I was like, well, hold on a second. We're gonna mandate this, take more time, then have to backfill personnel with overtime for individuals to get physicals when our members could right now on their own health insurance that's provided by the city go get a very similar physical and ask for additions. Could we see the difference there? And I actually ran into a bureaucratic roadblock because the insurance only wanted to give the physical that they normally pay for. But my members weren't going to get their normal annual physical that they were allowed to, or every 2 years, but yet they wanted the fire department to pay for it. And I'm like, well, how about your health care and your wages and working conditions? So it all came to a balance thing. So that's a huge expenditure. And can you elaborate? Are there other things that the training component, your organization talked about how many additional hours? Could you kind of break that down?
On the training component, the OSHA language talks, it references 21 NFPA professional qualification standards and safety standards, 21. And it's the term IBR, incorporated by reference. So in the proposed regulation, OSHA says, we hereby incorporate the following list of NFPA standards by reference. Now, that's a legal term. That means that OSHA is saying what's in those standards are going to be part of the proposed regulation to guide OSHA in reviewing local departments' compliance with the standard to see if they're compliant or if they're not by using those 21.
Now, Chief, before we go any further, I think this is an important question and I don't know the answer to it. So I'm curious myself and I don't want to miss the opportunity. Those NFPA standards are ever changing by, which I think is a good thing. People get together, they revise them, comments and things of that nature. When OSHA is referring to one of the NFPA standards, are they only incorporating what it says right now today? Say if it went into effect today, are they only incorporating what it says today, or are they also incorporating when that standard changes as well? Is this like a living statute regulation, or is it locked?
Yeah. So my understanding, Frank, based on my experience back in 2008 and what I understood, and I haven't seen a clarification that changes my mind, with the way the requirements for writing a federal regulation are, you have to be specific in citing a standard in the year the standard was developed. And if you want to choose that specific citation, that standard and year or edition, then you're going to have to go back through regulatory rulemaking to change it. Now, that's a huge undertaking. It is likely, in my understanding, that whatever edition of the standard has been cited by OSHA when they finally issue the rule will be captured in time going forward until they revisit rulemaking, which is, it took them 40 years to get to this point and revisit this rule. So I think to your question, when the rule is finally published, whatever version of the standard is referenced is what's going to be, the fire service will be held to.
I think that's very helpful, because that is kind of, I've been sifting through the comments to try to figure out how that actually is. By any chance, did you see the comment by President John Butler of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, where he gives estimate?
I have.
Okay, so in his comment, which I thought was fascinating, and I believe his estimates are very conservative, but he broke down by the number of responders on what he believes will be the impact of budgets. And he was saying that if a department had 70 or less responders, it could be as much as a 46% increase in annual budgets and up to 10 years to become fully compliant. And then for the larger departments, it was anywhere from 2% to 10%. So the United Fire Administration came out with a report in 2023 talking about how recruitment and retention is our biggest issue in the volunteer fire service. Well, now if we have all these expenditures and we're requiring the individuals to do more time, which is a disincentive, and I want our volunteers trained to the same standard. There are some departments that got it completely right, but they're in the minority. I'll give you an example. Montgomery County, Maryland, their volunteers are trained to the same standard as the career firefighters. They do duty nights. They go through the command competencies. Their training academy is second to none. I mean, that's where I'd like to get everybody. And that county format really helped get them there. Connecticut, we're the land of steady habits. We got 169 ways of doing the same thing, which just explodes cost. But what do you think of that? And I don't want to put you on the spot, but what do you think about that budget where he say, even if we just took the larger departments, if you did forget the 46%, if you did a 10% increase in individuals' budget outside of what their normal cost structure is, that's almost crippling because there's only so much of the pie to go around.
Yeah, for a career organization that's got some municipal funding, I think that 10% budget increase, that 10-year compliance, from my observation and my understanding, those are good benchmarks, and it's a starting point. I can't speak to the impact of the proposed rule in the equipment area and the apparatus and the PPE and the physicals because we're into training. I do know training costs money. To have qualified instructors to come out and deliver a program, it costs. You have to deal with the instructors, you have to deal with the curriculum, you have to support the students. So there's a definite cost increase there. And I know our academies are pretty stretched to the max. Like most fire service organizations, we're challenged to recruit and retain instructors. We're challenged to maintain adequate staffing and support and logistics personnel to support the classes. If a huge demand gets placed onto our members, we're concerned, where do we find all the bodies we need to support this influx of training? Having a phased-in timeline and being reasonable about that, I think, would soften the impact of the regulation. I know others have commented on that. But if you think about that department that is doing a pancake breakfast to put gas in the apparatus, 0.05% increase in their budget, 2 hours more of training per month. Those are huge impacts in a department that may only have a dozen active members who may be approaching our age, Frank, but they're still engaged because we know it can be challenging to get younger people interested in firefighting as a career, let alone as a volunteer. That's a real challenge. And the National Volunteer Fire Council has made the observation, not only would this impact budgets to a point, it could result in departments just closing shop and saying, you know what, we can't comply. We don't want to put our community and our members at risk of being found guilty of an OSHA violation that could have downstream implications, being personally borne by command officers and the leaders of the department. That's it. We're done. Find another option. In those areas, there is no other option. So that point has been made very loud and often through this comment process, the concern of the financial impact, not only on the large organizations where every dollar is just as needed, but those organizations who are living on threadbare budgets and might just say, well, we can't do this. We're out of the business.
Because it's going to increase liability as well, because it's almost an impossible thing to meet so quick. One of the other things, and you know, like I said, if I misspeak at all, please say no, that's not the case. I'm okay with that because I'm learning as we go here and I'm digging through these things. One thing that I know a lot of departments did to meet the spirit of 1001 is a lot of volunteers divided their department into interior firefighters versus exterior firefighters. So here they want to meet the standard. If you have this training, you can go inside the building. If you don't, and what we see is, like, I know a lot of retired firefighters bought houses in New Hampshire where they're not interior firefighters anymore, but they get the truck to the scene, they're exterior. Was there
Yep.
anything in this standard that allocates that difference? Because that was a problem that a lot of departments already solved. So was there any bifurcation in the medical evaluation that would allot for somebody who just drives the truck there?
So, and here's my thinking, because the proposed regulation cites the NFPA standard as the source for what's considered an adequate physical, and to my knowledge, I think it's 1582 doesn't have different levels of physical exam for fire service members. It goes under the assumption you're going to be exposed to an IDLH environment. These are the known hazards. This is what you have to do. However, the OSHA proposed regulation does identify 5 levels of activity a member of a fire department can provide. There's interior, there's exterior, there's support, and there's, I forget the other, but it does say that the employer, when you look at the role the individual is performing, as I just listed, are they doing advanced interior attack? Are they doing exterior? Are they doing support function? And the employer, once they've made that determination, has to then match the training to the expectation. But I did not see any language that connects the physical to that same alignment of the role you perform to the training you receive, which would be less for exterior versus interior, theoretically. I didn't see any linkage similar to that for physicals.
Okay, so I didn't either, and and that's a little concerning, because that right there just doesn't pass the common sense thing. If we thought enough on the training side because of that reason, and we know that that part is working, then they needed to do that also on the medical side. Back to the training, your organization's letter, I believe they classified it as 200 hours of additional training. I want to be fair. And I know this is just an estimate ballpark, but
Sure.
Is that kind of where we're at based off?
Yeah, the regulation says that you have to train the individual initially, and they call it vocational training for the job. So that's your firefighter 1, that would be your apparatus operator and whatnot. That's decided, and I've heard estimates about that's like close to 250, 300 hours, depending on where you are. But then it also says, the regulation also says, you must provide annual competency skills-based training and refreshers to keep skills current. And they list 6 NFPA standards that must be addressed when you do this skills training. NFPA 1001, which is firefighter 1, 1407, which is RIC, 1002, which is emergency vehicle operation, and if needed, fire officer, which is 1021, marine firefighting, NFPA 1005, wild firefighting, NFPA 1140, and lastly, tech rescue, NFPA 1006. Those are probably at least half of the amount of time that was taken to initially qualify you for those duties. You're going to need half of that time to maintain your competencies on an annual basis. So the cost of that, the dollar cost of that, will be dependent on the locale, but obviously it's a commitment of hours for individuals to be there, the resources to need it, and the funding to support it. So yeah, it's going to increase the required number hours of training for departments that are falling under the proposed OSHA standard.
And this seems to be, I remember after 9/11, where we got a lot of terrorism equipment for weapons of mass destruction, but we didn't get the money for the training to go with a lot of that equipment.
No.
And it's like, and when you come out when somebody mentions and says, oh, I don't believe this regulation should go in, you hear the pushback online in the online chatter. Oh, you're anti-firefighter, anti-safety. No, I'm personally anti-unfunded mandate. If it's important enough to mandate it through a federal dictate, then it's important enough to have an appropriations for it. Because what I'm worried about is, and we saw this in Connecticut, is that when you ask for everything, sometimes you get nothing. So, for example, in Connecticut, they require the fire marshals to inspect, I think it's every 3-family home once every year. but they never provided the money from the state. So it was a feel-good, empty promise that we need this for safety because nobody should die in a fire that doesn't have a smoke detector in a multi-home. I agree. But then provide them the money. And now what's happened is that law was passed so many years ago, and the municipalities, they just never funded it. And so there's, I'll go back to Greenwich, Connecticut. It's one of the most affluent communities in the country. And I was told they don't even meet their inspections for their fire marshals. I know we don't meet them in the city of New Haven or even in some of the other small towns. And one of the things that I saw in here, and I think it's vitally important, especially if a small community has, say, a chemical plant in it, like we've seen in Texas and places like that, is they have a requirement to do these site safety visions for these incident safety plans and SOPs. I think that's great. But what I could see happening from a public policy position is a lot of these small departments in Nebraska and all over the country, they have one paid fire marshal who's also the fire chief and maybe an assistant. So they're not meeting their unfunded mandates now. And now all of a sudden they're going to look at the fire marshal and say, well, we only have the volunteers come in one night a week. You're going to have to do all these site safety plans. And it's going to be another thing put on the desk of the fire marshals. I mean, feel free to weigh in or feel free to avoid it completely.
So you're absolutely right that this creates, if this regulation goes through as proposed, and I just found today, OSHA is holding a public hearing on, I think it's November the 12th. They just announced that. And on November the 12th, they will be accepting virtually people's in-person thoughts on the proposed regulation. I've got to believe, when I looked yesterday, I think there was almost 3,000 comments posted to the regulation, with many more in the queue waiting to be validated and posted. I got to believe my sense of the majority of these comments is, whoa, this isn't a game changer. This is a game ender for many organizations. And you need to rethink the scope, the application, the timeline, and you need to be sensitive to all of the things that we've talked about, Frank. So I'm somewhat optimistic that OSHA is going to hear that, and we're going to see something of a revised regulation, but I can't predict exactly how much.
And I got a couple calls from a volunteer fire department in upstate New York today, and from another jurisdiction as well. And another thing that the fire service really hasn't been considering that needs to be brought into the conversation is that there were two substantial landmark United States Supreme Court cases that went through the court this year that could have an impact on that. One was the SEC versus, and I'm going to mispronounce their name, and I won a Supreme Court case and everybody mispronounces my name, so I can get away with it. It's JARK, Sharks, ESY, SEC versus Jarksies. And like I said, I'm probably slaughtering that. But the crux of that case was the appointments clause of the United States Constitution, because administrative law judges don't go through the same appointment process. And they also called into question that the SEC promulgates the regulation, then they enforce the regulation, so they're the prosecutor, and then you go before an administrative judge in the same agency who then fines you. And the Supreme Court found that, no, you're entitled, because of your constitutional rights to a jury trial, to actually have a jury trial. So OSHA fits that same bill. They come up with a proposal, they fine you, and then you go before their own administrative judge, or in the states that have state plans, through a commission or the director of OSHA. Somebody within that organization determines if you get fined. The other case that I think holds a lot of weight here is Looper Bright. And I wrote for this for the Daily Caller for the Yankee Institute, the think tank I work for. And the crux of that case, you're a Massachusetts individual, was that an individual that owned a couple fishing vessels were mandated by the federal government to take on a third party certified by the government to regulate. So they'd have to take a third party regulator out on their fishing vessel for $710 a day to actually determine if the vessel was violating the law. And Looper Bright decision came down and said that if the statute is vague and has some ambiguity, then they couldn't rely on the agency's experts and have deference to those agency regulators. And I see some similarities here because we're deferring to NFPA, which is a third party. I wouldn't say it's a regulator, but it is a third party standard making organization. Would it be fair to say that we don't know if this is even going to withstand constitutional muster and it invites litigation?
Sure. And I think that's fair, Frank. We live in a constitutional based republic in the United States. And we see swings sometimes as to where our leadership nationally will allow power to be vested in regulatory agencies versus in Congress, the executive branch, and others. It's fair to say that we could be seeing a shift. We could be seeing a shift where our nation is beginning to question how much power should be vested in a regulatory agency versus in a judicial branch or an executive branch. So where that will end up is way above my pay grade. But, was it the birds that said the times they are changing? I think that's adequate. That's a good representation of where we are today. And you might have also seen the most recent Supreme Court decision involving Chevron. And it also was looking at specifically safety violations. And I can't remember if it was OSHA or Department of Labor that Chevron was having some challenges with. And the Supreme Court ruled that the federal agency had exceeded its rulemaking abilities and that it probably was more, it was going to be questioned and challenged. And they doubted that the federal agency had the authority it believed it did when it made the citations and took the action against Chevron. So
yes, that case that you were referencing is Looper Bright, and there was several other cases like Relentless that went into ending Chevron deference, but that's where it came from, was those fishing vessels and having those individuals. That was the crux of how it all got started.
Yeah,
it was a confusing case.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a shift. And one of the other things about the NFPA standards and incorporated by reference, and we included this as a comment to OSHA, when the government does incorporation by reference, they have to give those who are covered by the regulation easy access to the complete text of the documents so they know what they are being held, the standard they're being held to, so they can comply and develop their compliance plans. And just as a side note, sometimes in these processes, you don't have to comply right away, but you have to develop a compliance plan. You have to be knowledgeable of exactly what you're being held to and identify what you can do, what's a short-term and a long-term thing. And that might apply here once OSHA has its final regulation. But the only way you can access NFPA standards for free right now, and they do offer it in free versions, it's called free access, is one page at a time. And you can't download the standard, you can't print the standard. Some of the NFPA standards are hundreds of pages. So to be able, as an impacted fire service organization trying to comply with one of the more technical standards, hundreds of pages, and you're trying to navigate your way through, it's going to be challenging. The only way to solve that is to pay for a hard copy of the standard, which is about $120, a digital copy, which is probably $12, or a subscription service that will give you access to the whole inventory of standards on a monthly fee of about $10. The point being that if it's the intent of OSHA to comply with the federal guidelines for incorporated by reference, there are many organizations who could make the case that the availability of NFPA standards currently don't fit within that guideline. Just as you were saying, the courts have an ability to look at these things and say, yeah, you thought you were doing it, but maybe not enough. So this could be one of those other areas that OSHA is going to have to address or possibly see reviewed by an outside agency.
No, that's great insight because that goes with freedom of information and public access to records. And I'm really glad that you brought that up because I remember there was a court case about this issue some time ago, and I thought they remedied it by that you could get it free. But you're saying when you get it free online, you can only look at it one page at a time and you can't print it?
No.
Wow.
Nope.
See, that's what's great about Fire Engineering's Humpday Hangout. Every time I come on one of these shows, we always have great guests, and I always learn something more that I didn't know at the start of the show. And that's why these things are so valuable to the American Fire Service. We're almost at the witching hour. Is there anything else that you wanna add for our listeners or to send us off here, Ken? You were a great guest, and PJ Norwood did come through, even though he abandoned me tonight. he did come through. We got a great, competent guest, and I think I can speak for you and me is that we both want competent firefighters. We want training, and we want the fire service moving in the right direction. We're only questioning the process, not the goal.
Yeah, and I think that there's an opportunity for the fire service to have its voice heard, both individually through commenting on the OSHA regulations, through the membership organizations that represent you and you may belong to, and if not, maybe you want to find one to belong to strengthen that voice and amplify that voice. The NFPA process, there are seats on the technical committees that are available for folks to apply and to sit on the committee and bring your voice to the process. And lastly, I ask everybody who's on the Hangout, if you don't know where your state fire academy is and you don't know where their website is and you haven't looked to see what training's available that can help you do your job better, safer, more productively in today's challenging fire environment, I'm going to ask you to go and find that information and then make a decision. Maybe there's a course that interests you. Maybe you can get your chief to bring a course to you, but view the State Fire Academy as a resource to make your job as safe as it can possibly be, and that you enjoy, like I did, a great career to retire with your health, enjoy retirement with the grandkids, and continue working in the fire service.
Kevin Shea told me once that when he was in Catholic school, the nun asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. And he raised his hand and he said, a retired firefighter. Because if you're lucky enough to get through this career without multiple surgeries, getting hurt, hopefully not dying in the line of duty, it's critically important that training is what gets us to that healthy career. And even though I was hammering on those medical evaluations, it's critical for firefighters, especially if you have your own insurance. Make sure that you're getting your medical evaluations and push your department to get there. I just want there to be a balance of interest so that we're not extinguishing volunteer departments or driving city budgets right down, because it's not like the federal government. Your local government, your state government just can't print money. It all comes out of the taxpayers, and everybody's struggling a little bit. Not everybody's Wall Street. There's a lot of people that live on Main Street and off Main Street that are struggling in America, and government needs to be fair, but we need to continue to move in the right direction. Ken, honor to have you on the show. You're welcome back anytime. I think we'll have you back when PJ's here as this thing progresses, because I think that there'll be a lot more coming up from this. And I will give you the last word. If you want to say anything else, then we'll take it off for the night.
One thing, just remind everybody, if you haven't signed up for the National Firefighter Cancer Registry, it's a great way to enroll yourself in the study, but also, God forbid, you get diagnosed with cancer. Now you're part of this bigger initiative supporting research, the medical data, and it's valuable for that information to be tracked. So if your family needs access and needs the recognition that you were diagnosed with an occupational illness called cancer, it's there through the registry. So I encourage you to sign up for the National Firefighter Cancer Registry.
And data is the new oil. So having that data really can help us move the fire service forward. I think that's a great point. Tonight, we still have a heavy heart that a former fire chief, volunteer fire chief, was killed protecting his family at a political rally. There's no place for political violence, regardless of party, and we still have 2 individuals injured for that from that incident. And I just want to leave one thing, because I spent the the day working and watching the Secret Service hearing. If you're in a position of authority, you're the fire chief, you're the director of training, you have a responsibility to your members to ensure they're competent to answer the call. And I think incompetence in professional services like the fire service, there's a point where irresponsibility, ineptitude, and incompetence actually metastasizes to soft corruption. And that line is something that policymakers and department heads need to evaluate. But if you're a department head or you're a training officer, you owe it to your members, whether they're paid or volunteer, to ensure they're ready to answer the call. And again, get out and train. This is about firefighting training. I personally, and I believe that a lot of the organizations that are putting comments against this proposal, it's about the process, not about the goal, and not about where we need to go as the American Fire Service. That's it for Politics and Tactics tonight. Ken, great guest. Welcome back anytime. Mark, take us off.